I remember the first time I met him. The man who seemed to carry the weight of the world in his hands, yet insisted it was nothing more than careful stewardship. Every dollar he touched, every choice about spending or saving, was wrapped in layers of calculation and unease. It wasn't reckless spending or careless habits that defined him. On the contrary, he was a master of control. But as I sat across from him, watching the tension in his jaw and the tightness in his eyes, I realized control was a mask for something far deeper. He wasn't free. Not really. His financial life was a cage woven from fear, disguised as prudence. Like many of us, he believed that if he just held tight enough, watched every cent, and avoided risk at all costs, he could keep the darkness, the uncertainty, the scarcity, at bay. But all I saw was a man exhausted from trying to hold back a tide he couldn't control. This is not an uncommon story. I've met so many who live like this, caught in a loop where the need to control money comes from a place of fear. Fear that there won't be enough. Fear of making the wrong choice and losing what little they have. Fear that a single mistake could undo everything they worked tirelessly to protect. They don't waste money recklessly. Instead, they withhold it from life itself, never taking chances, avoiding investing in themselves, shying away from opportunities because the future feels like a minefield. You might recognize this feeling, the urge to grip your finances as tightly as possible, believing it's the safest path. The slow, creeping anxiety that bubbles beneath each decision, pushing you to say no when part of you wants to say yes. The exhausting vigilance that makes it impossible to relax around money, because every moment feels like a test you can't afford to fail. But here's the twist. The very things you think are protection may actually be the bars of a prison. The more rigid the control, the more life and growth slip through the cracks. Imagine watering a plant with fear instead of care. The roots don't stretch, the leaves don't bloom. Money isn't just a resource, it's energy, movement, potential. When fear tightens its grip, this vital energy stagnates, and no amount of cast iron control can change that. I've heard him say it many times. I'm just being responsible. I'm making sure I don't lose what little I have. But beneath those words was an unspoken truth, the silent voice of doubt and worry that never quieted. He worked harder than most, saved every penny he could, yet when he looked at his financial reality, it never matched his effort. It's like running a race in place, the ground beneath shifting even as your feet pound it. The sense of frustration, the weight of invisible limits. It's a common rhythm in his story and many others. What struck me most was how this hidden form of self-sabotage doesn't scream. It whispers, pulling you inward silently, gradually shrinking your world until it feels normal. And yet, something about it feels profoundly untrue to who you are, like a misfit stitch in the fabric of your life that you can't quite adjust. So, I want you to pause and consider this. What if the way you've been managing your money, the tight control, the fierce caution, is connected to a fear that's been quietly running your financial story all along? What if this fear, disguised as strength and discipline, is actually the reason growth feels just out of reach? What if by letting go of trying to control everything, you could begin to see different possibilities? I don't have all the answers yet. That's why I invited you to journey with me through understanding the unseen forces at play beneath this controlling pattern. Because when we look beneath the surface, we begin to understand not just what drives us, but how to start shifting it. And with that understanding comes a kind of freedom. Freedom from fear, freedom from exhaustion, and freedom to build a financial life that feels alive rather than locked down. Together, we'll explore why sometimes, the more we hold on, the more we lose. We'll uncover what's beneath the surface of this control, piece by piece, gently and carefully. And in doing so, maybe you'll start to feel, just a little, the stirring of something new, the possibility to let money breathe, to grow, and importantly, to serve you in ways you didn't know were possible. It starts here, with openness, with curiosity about the secret stories we tell ourselves about money and control. So, if you've ever caught yourself in this grip of fear disguised as prudence, if you felt stuck despite all your efforts, this journey is for you. And I promise, it's not about blame or shame. It's about understanding and kindness toward yourself. As we step forward, I invite you to be gentle with what you discover. There's no rush, no judgment, just the chance to see clearly what's been shaping your financial life and to imagine something different. A new way forward where money isn't an enemy to guard against, but a partner to embrace. And that begins not with numbers, but with the heart and mind behind them. I still remember the day when I first witnessed how tightly held anxieties translate into the everyday choices we make with money, and how often those choices build invisible walls around us. It was during a conversation with a close friend, Mark, whose cautious approach bordered on rigidity. Mark wasn't reckless by any means. In fact, his decision-making was meticulously planned. Yet, over time, I noticed he hesitated before embracing new ventures not because of a lack of interest, but because an undercurrent of unease paralyzed his judgment. It was as if his mind was wired to anticipate the worst, prompting endless calculations just to avoid any semblance of loss. Mark shared how he would spend hours double-checking bills and deliberating over even minor purchases. What struck me was his admission that often, after rigorous scrutiny, he'd simply end up postponing decisions altogether. The inertia wasn't due to indecision, but an overwhelming urge to avoid potential pitfalls, no matter how slight. His world contracted gradually, not from deliberate withdrawal, but from the slow suffocation of opportunities left unexplored. I could almost see it as a form of self-imprisonment carved out by the desire to stay safe. That encounter sparked a deeper curiosity within me about how anxiety about money fosters such mental strain that it becomes a trap. I realized this tension operates much like a complex feedback loop. The constant worry leads to controlling behaviors, which in turn increase stress and cloud judgment. Our brains, wired to protect us, can surprisingly get stuck in this loop, reacting not with flexibility, but with rigid patterns that ultimately sabotage growth. I find it illuminating to think of this cycle in terms of emotional muscle. Just as physical muscles become stiff and weak when they aren't stretched, our emotional resilience dwindles when we don't stretch ourselves financially and psychologically. When I tried explaining this to Mark, I described how holding money too tightly feels like clenching a fist. At first, it might feel secure, but eventually, that fist cramps and loses strength. The hand only regains power when it opens, allowing movement and flow. Money, in this sense, isn't just a resource, but a dynamic force that needs room to move freely to create energy and momentum. What complication arises, however, is that this mental tension extends beyond numbers. It permeates our identity. I noticed Mark often described himself in ways that echoed scarcity. Phrases like, "I'm not good with money," or "I don't deserve more," surfaced during our talks, revealing an internal dialogue steeped in self-doubt. These beliefs, hidden yet persistent, shape the way we interact with opportunities. When I shared observations about this with Mark, he was initially defensive, but soon he acknowledged how these thoughts acted like an anchor, pulling him deeper into caution. Now, consider what happens when this mindset meets change or risk, both of which are inevitable in any journey involving money. During one of our brainstorming sessions, Mark admitted how even minor shifts in his routine, an unexpected bill or a new investment opportunity, triggered a cascade of anxious thoughts. His mind jumped to worst-case scenarios with astonishing speed, paralyzing his ability to act decisively. In effect, the unknown became an adversary to be defended against rather than an opening to be explored. From my perspective, this dynamic resembles how a tightly coiled spring behaves. Initially under tension, it resists movement to conserve energy, but without release, that energy accumulates pressure that can snap unexpectedly. People like Mark, and perhaps some reading this, carry this compressed energy throughout their days. It's invisible to others, yet weighs heavily on their internal experience, dictating choices that feel safe but limit possibility. What's even more subtle is how this tension might appear as consistency or reliability to outsiders, but feels suffocating to the person living it. The challenge then, and what I've come to understand more deeply, is that escaping this tension requires more than adjusting budgets or tracking expenses. It calls for an emotional shift, one that loosens the mind's grip on certainty and invites exploration, even in the face of discomfort. When Mark began to experiment with small acts of trust, like delegating financial decisions or allowing a modest, purposeful expense, he opened cracks for new possibilities. Those small acts, while scary, peeled away layers of rigidity, offering glimpses of what life might look like if tension became ease. As I observed his journey, I also reflected on the paradox that in trying to protect ourselves from scarcity, we may unknowingly create a scarcity of experience itself. Opportunities vanish not because they aren't available, but because the mental posture discourages engagement. This trap can be likened to a garden fenced so tightly the plants never receive sunlight or fresh air. The fence, intended as protection, becomes a barrier to growth. This brings me to a crucial insight. The way we respond to uncertainty has ripple effects beyond immediate outcomes. It shapes how our emotional resources renew or deplete over time. When my mind is relentlessly braced for loss, it consumes energy better spent on creativity or resilience. Whereas, when there's space for vulnerability alongside intention, I notice a surprising steadiness emerges. It's not about reckless risk-taking, but about creating a relationship with money where flow coexists with responsibility. So, if you find yourself hesitating, frozen by the thought of what might go wrong, know that this isn't just hesitation. It's a complex terrain of mental tension and unmet emotional needs. Recognizing this tension as a form of resource use, rather than mere reluctance, transforms the challenge into something approachable. By tuning into how your body and mind carry this weight, you become better equipped to respond with kindness and clarity. Ultimately, this means reimagining control not as a fortress, but as a dance, a balance between holding firm and allowing movement. And as I've seen with Mark, that dance begins when we give ourselves permission to let go, ever so slightly, trusting that we can catch ourselves on the other side. When I sat across from Jenna, watching her scrawl yet another list of must-not overspend items, a subtle restlessness simmered beneath her disciplined exterior. Unlike others driven by impulsiveness, Jenna's meticulous checks and balances stemmed from an impulse to barricade herself against unpredictability. Yet, I sensed an invisible barrier forming not just around her budget, but within her worldview, one where apprehension dictated every pathway, narrowing her horizon as if she were walking a hallway lined with locked doors. Her commitment to constant vigilance wasn't anchored in mere prudence. It was more like a fortress erected stone by stone, where every expense became a battlefront against imagined calamity. Even small deviations, like treating herself to a book or investing in a creative workshop, set off an internal alarm. Why waste on luxuries? I heard her whisper, while her eyes betrayed a hidden yearning. Her cautiousness, cultivated over years, hadn't just reshaped her spending habits. It rewired how she imagined her future, conceiving it as a fragile glass orb at risk of shattering. One afternoon, Jenna confided in me about her recurring dream, a room filled with jars, each labeled with a financial goal or emergency. In her dreams, she locked them tightly, guarding each as if it contained her essence. The image felt symbolic, a manifestation of a psyche intent on containment. The jars represented her ambitions, relationships, and growth, all confined within rigid glass. This dream illuminated a deeper truth. She wasn't merely protecting assets, but restricting potential. Our conversations veered into how such ingrained habits influence our perception of risk. Jenna shared a vivid memory from childhood, where unpredictability in her household bred an appetite for control. The bills piled high like unspoken threats, she said. Over time, such environments forge a subconscious blueprint, teaching us to equate stability with rigidity. While structure is essential, morbid fixation can calcify adaptability, rendering us prisoners to our own safeguards. What struck me was how her constant need for reassurance led to emotional numbing. Every cautious decision, while seemingly logical, chipped away at moments of joy. The exhilaration of spontaneity or the warmth of carefree generosity felt increasingly foreign. She recounted feeling adrift during celebrations because the mind busied itself tallying expenses rather than savoring connection. This detachment wasn't born from absence of affection, but from overprotectiveness, a self-crafted moat isolating her from the currents of life. When I suggested experiments with intentional looseness, Jenna was skeptical. What if letting go means losing everything? She asked, eyes searching for certainty in a sea of doubt. I responded by sharing a story from my own life. How an unexpected decision to invest modestly in a passion project once terrified me, yet blossomed into an enriching journey. The key wasn't reckless abandon but conscious trust, a deliberate step beyond the known. This, I told her, is akin to training a muscle that hasn't been stretched. Initial discomfort precedes newfound strength. As her narrative evolved, I noted how her relationship with discomfort began to shift. Instead of viewing uncertainties as threats, she started perceiving them as signals, messengers inviting her to test boundaries. I watched the gradual unfreezing in her demeanor during our sessions. The metaphorical walls softened, allowing glimpses of optimism to seep through. The daily ledger she once guarded like a fortress transformed into a map, highlighting places she could explore rather than barricade. One revealing moment was when Jenna spoke about a small workshop she'd signed up for. Usually, even minor commitments sparked hesitation, but this time she surprised herself by embracing the opportunity. It's scary, but thrilling, she admitted. She anticipated financial loss, but found instead a seed of unexpected fulfillment. Here, the paradox unfolded beautifully. The act she feared might cost her dearly became an investment in her own vitality and clarity. Throughout this shift, Jenna's language changed. Saving morphed into nurturing, and protecting softened into cultivating. It wasn't just behavioral adaptation, but a rewriting of inner scripts, the narratives that told her who she was in relation to resources and worth. Each small experiment created room for resilience, proving that security emerged not from absolute control, but from the courage to embrace imperfections. Now, consider how this applies when you face decisions that challenge your established patterns. Are you willing to perceive hesitation not as failure, but as a herald of growth? Can you distinguish between guarding your future and imprisoning your present? The path Jenna charted isn't linear and demands patience, but it demonstrates that evolving beyond entrenched habits is not only feasible, but life-affirming. Our minds, after all, crave stories of possibility and connection, not only safety and restraint. When we begin to rewrite our financial narratives with compassion and openness, we unlock not just resources, but reservoirs of creativity and joy. Jenna's journey reminds me that relinquishing absolute certainty is not surrender. It's invitation, an invitation to dance with ambiguity and discover treasures hidden within the unknown. I remember the afternoon Sarah called me, her voice tight with exhaustion. She'd just spent hours poring over her bank statements, adjusting budgets down to the last dollar, only to find that despite all her efforts, her sense of unease hadn't budged. "I'm so tired of watching every cent and still feeling like I'm sinking," she confessed. What struck me was how she described her attempts at precision, not as confidence, but as a frantic battle against an invisible tide pulling at her footing. It was as if each act of careful calculation was an effort to construct a dam that kept breaking under pressure. Sarah revealed how her preoccupation extended beyond money itself, invading her daily relationships and inner dialogue. She'd noticed how her mind compulsively circled around worst-case scenarios, not simply guarding against losses, but anticipating disasters yet to come. During conversations, her eyes darted frequently toward the clock, intuition telling her time was slipping away. I could almost feel the weight of her cognitive load pressing heavily upon her, squeezing space for joy, curiosity, or spontaneity. Every decision felt monumental, each choice a precarious balancing act. What fascinated me was how this ongoing vigilance seemed to erode Sarah's ability to trust her judgment. Instead of fostering clarity, relentless monitoring fractured her focus, creating a fog that blurred possibilities and narrowed perspective. It was as though attentiveness morphed into hypervigilance, a relentless mental watchtower that monitored dangers but prevented freedom of movement. When I asked Sarah about moments when she felt most overwhelmed, she described an exhausting mental knot, a cyclic harnessing of anxiety that endlessly tightened and rarely released. Unraveling this mental knot calls for more than just attempting to relax. It requires reclaiming the capacity to experience uncertainty without paralysis. During a session, I introduced Sarah to an exercise I often use to reframe overwhelming anticipation, imagining her financial mindset as an old garden overrun with wild vines. The relentless attempts at meticulous pruning had left the flowers starved of sunlight and nutrients. Yet, paradoxically, letting go of some control allowed the garden to breathe again, encouraging new buds to sprout. The metaphor resonated deeply. She began envisioning her situation not as a siege, but as a natural cycle of growth, decay, and renewal. Another subtle dimension that emerged was how this pattern affected Sarah's physical well-being. Chronic mental strain triggered sleepless nights, tension headaches, and a tightness in her chest, a literal, embodied manifestation of her unease. She hadn't connected these symptoms with her money-related stress until I gently pointed it out. This realization was pivotal. Once she acknowledged the bodily signs, we engaged in experiments that integrated mindfulness and bodily awareness into her financial routine. Closing her eyes and tuning into her breath before tackling sensitive money discussions became a way to reset the nervous system, slowing the spiraling thoughts. A breakthrough came when Sarah shared a recent experience. She allowed herself to decline a lucrative, but unfamiliar, freelance opportunity because it stirred discomfort. Initially, she saw it as a missed chance, but gradually she noticed the liberation in honoring her boundaries and intuition. The story flipped a common script. We often believe seizing every opportunity equals success, but sometimes it's the art of discernment that fosters true progress. This realization opened a door where self-compassion replaced perfectionism, and strategic retreat became an act of courage rather than failure. As Sarah stepped into this newfound relationship with change, she also began exploring how shared vulnerability could ease her load. She reached out to a trusted friend and admitted her anxieties, breaking years of isolation around money secrets. The relief was palpable. Confiding transformed fear into a relatable human experience, dissolving shame and inviting empathy. As stories flowed between them, Sarah didn't just gain emotional support. She uncovered fresh perspectives that broadened her understanding of abundance and scarcity. Thinking back on Sarah's path, I see how these shifts created a ripple effect, gradually loosening rigid thought patterns and inviting curiosity. Instead of limiting her options through an ironclad set of rules, she allowed for experiments, mistakes, and recalibrations. The act of releasing a small part of vigilance turned out to be a form of courage that invited greater resilience. What once felt like surrender gradually transformed into a textured dance, balancing careful attention with mindful release. Now, reflect on moments where you might feel caught in a mental loop, scrutinizing options to exhaustion. Where are you exhausting precious energy trying to guard yourself from every conceivable outcome? Could you try to ease the grip slightly and invite perspective that views uncertainty as a dynamic landscape instead of an adversary? Often, the invitation isn't to abandon care, but to weave in softness and presence amidst decision-making. In doing so, you might rediscover the freedom to move through your financial world with a lighter heart and renewed strength. One afternoon, I found myself sitting across from Liam, whose eyes held a quiet desperation masked by careful composure. His hands fidgeted with a worn leather wallet, a relic from better times, he explained, as if physically gripping it tighter could somehow tether fleeting security. Unlike the haste of quick spenders I'd encountered before, Liam's caution felt more like an anchor dragging him down. Yet beneath his diligent budgeting and the meticulous spreadsheets lay an unspoken exhaustion, as though he was swimming against a current he couldn't see but constantly sensed. Liam shared a recurring image from his childhood, a family dinner where money was whispered about like a taboo subject, submerged beneath layers of shame and silence. The legacy wasn't just about scarcity. It was an invisible script written into his psyche that wealth was synonymous with danger, something unstable to be concealed rather than embraced. When he recounted these memories, his voice softened, revealing cracks beneath the armor of control he'd built around his finances. It dawned on me that his belief system wasn't simply about caution. It was interwoven with an early emotional blueprint that coded money as perilous. As our dialogue deepened, I began to see that Liam's gripping need to manage each expense stemmed from a profound aversion to unpredictability. But curiously, this rigidity paradoxically heightened his ongoing tension, weaving a complex fabric of anxiety. His mind was a hamster wheel, tirelessly turning scenarios where even minor deviations threatened collapse. Despite knowing logically that some risk was inevitable, his emotional wiring routed him to constrict rather than expand, sealing opportunities behind walls of hesitation. What amazed me was the way Liam's cautiousness extended beyond dollars and cents. It infiltrated his creativity and aspirations. He spoke of art projects never begun, trips never booked, and friendships strained because invitations to life's pleasures were declined out of fear. It was almost as if his financial freeze ripple effect encased his whole existence, muting colors into grayscale. The real cost of this control wasn't just missed money-making chances. It was a slow erosion of his own aliveness. It reminded me vividly of the way a frozen river loses its vitality, no longer shimmering with potential, but becoming brittle and prone to cracking under pressure. One breakthrough came when I invited Liam to describe his ideal life without the invisible chains of doubt. Initially, he struggled to imagine a space where letting go didn't mean loss or chaos. But as his words unfolded, a fragile landscape emerged, a garden where finances flowed like a gentle stream, nourishing his passions and relationships. This revelation wasn't just poetic. It revealed an inner longing suppressed beneath years of survival mode. I felt that for Liam, craving control was less about protecting money and more about shielding an inner vulnerability, a tenderness he rarely admitted. Eager to test this fragile courage, I suggested an experiment. For 1 week, choose one small area of spending or investment where control would loosen just slightly. Liam chose to sign up for an online class in portrait painting, a long-delayed dream. The act felt both scandalous and thrilling. It's like stepping off a ledge, he confessed, but also catching a breath midair. This metaphor stayed with me because it captured the frightening freedom many experience when confronting their guarded patterns. Opening a pocket of trust was like encountering a fresh wind after seasons of suffocating stillness. Through the following days, Liam reported not only new creative insights, but a surprising reduction in his overall stress. Unexpectedly, the loosening didn't unravel his world but seemed to ripple outward, easing the grip on his mood and self-judgment. He admitted to moments of doubt. What if I wasted money? He'd muse. But in those times, he began practicing a gentler voice, one that frames mistakes as learning rather than catastrophe. This was a profound shift. Control wasn't abandoning responsibility, but creating space for possibility. Another essential layer emerged when Liam reflected on the subtle impact this change had on his connections. Previously, financial secrecy and embarrassment kept him isolated. Now, he started sharing his journey with a close friend. The exchange sparked empathy and, unexpectedly, collaborative ideas for growth. It underscored a vital truth. Breaking free isn't a solitary endeavor, but a shared human experience. This communal element softened Liam's internal fortress further, reminding him that vulnerability begets belonging. Now, imagine yourself in Liam's position. Imagine sitting with your own tightly held fears and observing what stories they tell you about safety and loss. Consider the moments when opening the hand might invite renewal instead of depletion. What dreams or desires have you tucked away behind walls of calculation and caution? Sometimes, daring to reframe control as a dynamic choice instead of a necessary burden can liberate unseen courage within. I invite you to explore what small steps might awaken that courage in your life. Those first breaths of fresh air waiting beneath the layers of guarded restraint. There was a moment during one of my sessions with Maya that shifted my understanding of control entwined with fear in ways I hadn't anticipated. Maya was a woman in her early 40s, whose life was a delicate weave of spreadsheets and emergency cash stashes carefully guarded like precious heirlooms. Yet, beyond her meticulous tracking and disciplined habits, I sensed a silent battle raging inside her. One not with dollars, but with the stories she'd absorbed about money's meaning. One afternoon, Maya shared a memory from adolescence when her mother, under the weight of financial crisis, urged her to never trust others with money. Those words echoed like a mantra she clung to, morphing trust into a scarce commodity. Far from a casual lesson, this principle shaped her entire relationship with resources, erecting walls not only around what she earned but around invitations for collaboration and generosity. It was as if every transaction came with invisible clauses of suspicion and guardedness. This revelation made me realize that the grip Maya had on financial decisions was closely sewn with an inability to accept help or share resources freely. Her control filtered through her social life too, avoiding invitations that involved spending, declining friendships centered around experiences she deemed too costly, shrinking her world quietly yet relentlessly. On one occasion, she confessed to turning down a trip abroad because admitting her desire would expose vulnerabilities she wanted to conceal. The fear-fueling control in her case wasn't just about loss. It was about exposure. When I gently invited Maya to consider alternative ways of viewing trust, a subtle but profound tension unfolded. She began to explore scenarios where vulnerability wasn't a threat but a bridge, connecting rather than dividing. We discussed the difference between caution and isolation, and when she ventured to try small acts of openness, like sharing a financial goal with a colleague, the response was surprisingly supportive. The act felt like lowering psychological armor after decades of standing guard, freeing parts of her that had been held captive. One striking element that emerged was Maya's realization that control had paradoxically limited her abundance by shrinking her relational networks. Our conversation revealed that wealth isn't merely an individual accumulation, but a dynamic exchange. Her financial isolation had inadvertently muted opportunities for growth that come from shared experiences and mutual trust. It was akin to hoarding soil in a single pot, expecting a garden to flourish without nurturing the broader ecosystem. Building on this insight, Maya began experimenting with what I now call communal financial courage, small exercises in combining prudence with connection. For example, she joined a local investment club, not to chase profits, but to immerse herself in collective learning and dialogue. The experience rekindled a sense of belonging and hope, bathing her previously rigid boundaries in light and warmth. These steps were tentative and intertwined with discomfort, yet they sparked a transformation that rippled through both her finances and her sense of self. During another session, Maya mentioned how acknowledging her limits invited a balm she hadn't known was missing: permission to receive, not only give. Allowing others to contribute or assist shifted her perspective, calming the relentless vigilance that had governed her decisions. She described feeling an unexpected relief, as if she'd been carrying a heavy load alone and was finally offered a hand. This gesture, conceptually small but emotionally substantial, opened space for creativity and spontaneity in her approach. As our work progressed, Maya's narrative evolved dramatically. Control slowly shed its constrictive form and became an adaptive skill, one employed with discernment rather than rigidity. She started nurturing projects that felt risky before: a side business, volunteering at a nonprofit, even small celebrations with friends she used to avoid. These acts of engagement wove threads of richness into her life tapestry, softening fear's imprint with a more vibrant palette. Now, picture how Maya's journey illuminates the hidden layers within your own financial decisions. Where might hesitation mask a deeper reluctance to open yourself to others? Could the walls built for protection also be barriers obstructing growth, meaningful connection, or new opportunities? Sometimes embracing interdependence becomes the seed from which genuine financial resilience blossoms, not through solitary struggle, but through shared experience and trust. Next time you find yourself clutching tightly to your resources or instincts out of suspicion, ask if there's room to invite in collaboration or support. Notice what surfaces when the script changes from guarding alone to navigating together. You might uncover that financial abundance isn't an isolated achievement, but a dance requiring openness, courage, and a web of relationships held gently yet firmly. This unveiling is where control in service of fear can begin its transformation into control rooted in strength and connection. I recall a moment when I sat quietly with Marcus, a man whose financial world was a carefully maintained labyrinth of shoulds and musts. Unlike the typical fear-driven urge to hoard or avoid spending, Marcus grappled with a different psychological undertow, an overwhelming compulsion to predict and preempt every possible outcome before making a single move. It was as if his mind was a siege engine, endlessly crafting defenses, yet by constructing these endless ramparts, the castle slowly became his prison. Marcus told me about a recent experience where he spent several days agonizing over whether to invest in an online course that promised to expand his skill set. Every scenario he imagined spun deeper into uncertainty. What if he wasted money? What if the training failed to deliver? What if, despite his efforts, the future shifted unexpectedly, nullifying the advantage? Watching him recount this, I felt the palpable weight his anticipatory anxiety imposed on him. The irony lay in how his desire to prepare thoroughly had eclipsed his ability to act at all. What fascinated me in Marcus's story was the way his anxiety embedded itself within the very architecture of his decision-making. Instead of spontaneity or openness to possibility, his cognition recoiled into a hyper-analytical loop. The mental landscape resembled an overgrown thicket where every path forked into countless tendrils of what-ifs, tangled and suffocating. As his internal dialogue pulsed relentlessly, it left little room for creative impulse, turning opportunity into a source of dread rather than excitement. In one of our sessions, I invited Marcus to imagine a different metaphor, not a fortress, but a river that bends, erodes, and adapts without yielding its strength. I asked him to picture his financial journey as a current, sometimes rushing, sometimes still, with an ability to flow around obstacles instead of fighting them headlong. This idea sparked a flicker of recognition. He murmured, "I've been trying to dam every bend. Maybe it's time to let the water find new routes." The shift from rigid planning to fluid navigation opened a space within him for flexibility and acceptance. Marcus also shared the physical manifestations of his mental strain. He described nights consumed by restless thoughts, a tightness in his chest that pills failed to alleviate, and a gnawing fatigue that crept into his mornings. These bodily reflections, I realized, were messages from a mind under siege by its own vigilance. Through gentle guidance, we incorporated breath-focused exercises and conscious moments of pause into his weekly routine. Gradually, these small acts of self-soothing became breakwaters against the storm, helping him untangle the coils of relentless expectation. One afternoon, Marcus recounted stepping out of his comfort zone in a subtle but powerful way. He allowed himself to commit to a small investment, a book on personal branding that, in the past, he might have rejected as unnecessary spending. What delighted him wasn't just the book itself, but the act of surrendering control, if only for a moment. It felt like letting out a held breath, he shared. This release wasn't about abandoning prudence, but engaging with uncertainty on his own terms, a dance between caution and curiosity. Interestingly, this small act rippled outward. Marcus found that loosening his grip in one area emboldened him to examine other corners where inflexible patterns had calcified. He started experimenting with budgeting that allowed for surprise expenses or occasional splurges earmarked for joy. These experiments unsettled his usual defenses, but, over time, cultivated resilience and joy. The very rigidity he feared would cause collapse ended up obscuring pockets of possibility and contentment waiting to be uncovered. Through our work, another revelation emerged. Marcus recognized that his constant striving for control was fueled by an unconscious equation equating predictability with safety. Yet, paradoxically, this quest often produced the opposite effect, heightened sensations of vulnerability and helplessness. By shifting his mindset to see uncertainty as a domain of exploration rather than a threat to be neutralized, he began reclaiming emotional bandwidth that had been long surrendered to worry. Now, envision how this process might unfold in your own financial life. When faced with a significant decision, what if the instinct to meticulously map every potential pitfall softened into curiosity about paths unexplored? Could inviting curiosity, alongside careful reflection, transform the way you experience choice and risk? Embracing a fluid approach doesn't imply recklessness. It invites an adaptable resilience that flows with change rather than battles against it. Visualize yourself as that river, navigating shifting terrain with grace and strength, sometimes pausing in calm pools, at other times surging ahead to carve new channels. This metaphor serves as a beacon, reminding us that flexibility can coexist with intention, and that relinquishing rigid control can open vistas of unforeseen opportunity and growth. Through my time with Marcus, I witnessed the profound liberation that emerges when we learn to trust the current rather than cling to the banks. The first time I noticed the subtle but profound impact of fear cloaked as control in a different light was during a conversation with Elena. She had an uncanny ability to list every expense down to the cent, yet beneath her precise accounting lay an invisible grid of unwritten rules governing what she allowed herself to spend time and energy on. What struck me was the emotional cost of these restrictions. Her habits had become second nature, like a script she followed without question, yet they drained her vitality and dimmed her enthusiasm for growth. Elena described a recurring internal struggle. Each financial decision felt like directing an orchestra where every instrument was a possible threat. Instead of delighting in the possibilities money could offer, her mind was preoccupied with maintaining a sense of order, making certain that no wrong notes slipped through. This orchestration was exhausting, and her need for control had evolved into a rigid choreography that left little room for improvisation or joy. As she articulated this, her voice quivered, betraying the pressure of maintaining perfection and the loneliness woven into that pattern. Digging deeper, I uncovered that Elena's fixation stemmed from an early sense of invisibility in her family. In a household where survival trumped expression, financial matters were shrouded in silence, and emotional needs were quietly sacrificed at the altar of perceived safety. She carried forward this legacy by attempting to micromanage every transaction and outcome, believing that any laxity would quickly unravel the fragile tapestry of security she so fiercely guarded. Yet ironically, the more tightly she held, the more disconnected she became from the sense of possibility that money could represent. What fascinated me was how her control extended beyond calculations and budgets into the rhythms of her daily life. Simple pleasures, like dining out or investing in a hobby, were filtered through a lens of suspicion and self-discipline. She confessed that her days often felt like a series of small cutbacks and withheld invitations, not because the resources weren't available, but because an inner voice whispered warnings about potential disaster. This internal blockade, invisible to outsiders, created an invisible moat that kept excitement and spontaneity at bay. I remember encouraging Elena to envision an alternative scenario, a day where she allowed herself to embrace uncertainty and invest in an experience without preemptively tallying gains or losses. Her initial response was hesitation, framed by years of conditioning that equated freedom with chaos. Yet, laced within that hesitation was a flicker of curiosity. Together, we imagined how this freedom could influence not just numbers, but her well-being and sense of self. In that moment, the walls she'd built began to show cracks, revealing a yearning for ease she'd long denied. Elena's breakthrough unfolded when she began practicing what she called financial spontaneity exercises. These weren't reckless gambles, but deliberate invitations to loosen control in a specific domain. Say, buying a book she'd wanted for years or attending a local art class without calculating its return. Each small act felt like a rebellion at first, eliciting a cocktail of excitement and guilt. Over time, however, these exercises rewired her neural pathways, translating into an expanded emotional bandwidth. She learned to savor moments unfettered by relentless self-monitoring. An unexpected ripple effect of this softening was a newfound willingness to engage others in her goals. Previously closed off by the fear of judgment or failure, Elena tentatively shared her plans with close friends and sought advice without the burden of perfectionistic fear. This social openness transformed her sense of isolation and sparked collective energy, making progress feel less like a solo marathon and more like a community dance. Her control had boxed in not only resources, but also the generosity of connection. I was struck by Elena's acknowledgement that control had been a double-edged sword. It created a false sense of safety while sapping color from her aspirations. Her journey illuminated a powerful truth, that courage often hides in the cracks of vulnerability, waiting for a gentle invitation. Stepping beyond the compulsion to micromanage finances didn't promise safety from uncertainty, but offered the chance to experience money as a dynamic stream capable of nourishing growth rather than constricting it. Now, picture yourself in Elena's shoes. Where could easing your grip unlock fresh energy, creativity, or joy? What stories about security might you release to let light in? Each of these questions opens a door dual in challenge and promise, inviting a transformation less about control and more about harmony with the ebb and flow of life's unpredictable currents. As we move deeper into this exploration, I find myself sitting with a quiet awareness that threads through every subtle shift and hesitation we've encountered. It's as if we've been navigating a dimly lit room, feeling along the edges of walls that once seemed solid, only now revealing faint cracks where light begins to sneak through. There's a certain weight that lifts, not abruptly, but gently, when we allow ourselves to witness the intricate dance between caution and yearning, between the urge to guard and the yearning to expand. I recall moments when the urge to seize control felt like clutching a fragile branch amidst a rapidly flowing river, gripping tightly out of fear that letting go would unleash chaos. Yet, beneath that grip, the current patiently invites a different rhythm, whispering that flow need not equate to loss. This tension between holding tight and surrendering offers a landscape both daunting and ripe with possibility. I notice within myself the trembling edges of resistance softening, as if the mind's vast terrain is beginning to admit that safety and movement can coexist in harmony. It is fascinating to sit with this murmur of change and reflect on the silent conversations unfolding inwardly. Our narratives around stability morph into stories where flexibility gains dignity. The imagined fortress of self-protection reconfigures into a garden where barriers are porous and nurturing. This evolving architecture supports not a fortress defended by rigid walls, but a sanctuary shaped by openness and trust in the unseen service of growth. In these quiet shifts, our internal dialogues unfurl, allowing seeds of reassurance to root in fertile soil. I sense, too, the subtle interplay between vigilance and fatigue, how intense focus can become a silent thief of energy, stealing the capacity for spontaneous joy and curiosity. In these moments, I empathize deeply with the way we might try to micromanage the unpredictable terrain of life, attempting to engineer outcomes with precision so exact it collapses the very space in which creativity and vision bloom. The experience unfolds like a dance where each step forward is hesitant, yet each faltering moment is imbued with the possibility of new direction. It's within this delicate give and take that transformation arises, not through force, but through attentive yielding. Engaging with these internal landscapes brings me into contact with a profound paradox. The measures meant to secure comfort can sometimes breed quiet isolation, distilling our worlds to narrower scopes and muffling the resonance of connection. Yet, a shift towards vulnerability, though uneasy, acts as a key unlocking hidden chambers, inviting us to rediscover kindness towards ourselves and others. This gentle breach in the walls permits not only the entry of light, but the possibility of shared growth and collective nourishment, reminding me that financial lives are woven of more than dollars. They are threads in a communal tapestry. At the heart of this unfolding journey lies a tender invitation to rethink the contours of control as an evolving art, rather than a fixed state. Just as rivers carve their paths patiently amid obstacles, adapting and bending without losing force, we too may learn to meet uncertainty with poised resilience. I find myself embracing the image of movement that is alive and responsive, trading stiffness for fluidity, fear for curiosity. There's a growing sense within me that the landscape of financial well-being is not a battleground to be conquered, but an unfolding story to be authored with compassion. This threshold pulses with potential, a place where inner limits soften and expansive avenues appear. It beckons us to step gently, to explore the delicate balance between intention and surrender, unlocking a creativity suppressed for too long. As I sit with this emerging harmony, I am reminded that true transformation seldom arrives in grand gestures. Instead, it arises in the subtle recalibrations, in the choice to lean into discomfort, to embrace ambiguity, and to trust in the unfolding process. The journey itself becomes a testament to resilience, a testament to the courage of allowing ourselves to grow beyond ingrained scripts and towards something more alive and connected. Together, we stand at this cusp, sensing the quiet breath before the next movement, poised to step into a chapter where possibility takes root in the fertile interplay of presence and courage. There was a late evening when I found myself reflecting on the intricate dance between grip and release, a dance that often defines our relationship with money in ways we hardly admit to ourselves. I sat quietly, watching the sky darken, and realized that the deepest challenge isn't about mastering finances or numbers, but about unraveling the unconscious bindings holding us captive. These bindings, woven from fear and the urge to control, create an illusion of security that ultimately restrains us. In that moment, it became clear, surrendering a little of our certainty can open entirely new landscapes we hadn't dared to imagine. I think back to the countless conversations where people revealed their battles wrapped in meticulous caution, a protective shield masking a profound inner fragility. The weary eyes, the restless minds, each telling stories of relentless guarding. Yet, beneath that armor, I sensed a yearning as ancient as time, the desire not to be imprisoned by scarcity, but to feel the breeze of abundance brush against their lives. It's remarkable how the shackles most threatening aren't forged by external forces, but by the walls we build inside, brick by brick, in attempts to stay safe. One afternoon, I recall sitting with a dear friend who described their thought patterns as an endless checklist, each item a knot tying their hands tighter. Their vulnerability surfaced when they admitted that even small risks carried the weight of catastrophic possibilities in their mind. But as we explored images beyond survival, imagining a garden that flourishes from soil loosened and tended, a transformation quietly blossomed. It was as if the mind, long starved of freedom, inhaled a fresh breath, hinting at something radically different, a life where curiosity and courage coexist with responsibility. What remains vivid to me is the paradox nestled within our attempts at control. An intense effort to hold everything in place often multiplies our sense of fragility. In our conversations, I witnessed that seemingly stable structures sometimes felt brittle, prone to fractures invisible from the outside, but deeply felt inside. It reminded me of how a tightly stretched fabric eventually tears under strain, while a garment woven with flexibility endures and adapts beautifully. There was a turning point, too, marked by instances of small yet powerful leaps, allowing finances to breathe, accepting imperfect choices, or taking a chance on an